This podcast contains murder and mayhem, guts and gore, adult language, and sexual content. Exactly what you came here for. All the listener discretion is advised. Welcome. I am your mistress of the macabre, Sarah Tierra. Grab your Ouija board, light the candles, and grab your jar of human teeth because you and I are going to escape for a bit. Pour yourself a cocktail, pull the window shades closed, and find a cool, dark, quiet place. Because right now we delve into the macabre. Hello, and welcome back to the Mistress of the Macabre podcast. It's me, Sarah Tierra. That's it. I don't know what else to say. I am so glad to be back. I've missed you guys, my little baby gremlins, and I have another weird case for you. This podcast has been an exercise in being flexible. I had a whole ass list of episode topics that I wanted to do like right from the beginning of the show, and then starting accelerated college just took a shit all over them. It's been very bizarre. There's been no rhyme or reason besides what I think I can get done with the time that I have. Anyways, all that being said, here we are. Here's another weird one. You are welcome. Also, right up front, if you are like a descendant of Frank Lloyd Wright, I don't think you should probably listen to this. I thought I liked this man. I was a fan. I guess I'm still a fan of his work, but I am not a fan of him. That's for sure. So if that's like your great-grandfather, this is not for you. Okay? I warned you. So let's dive right in. Oh, one more thing. This is going to be 2 parts. And it was kind of weird and hard to break it into 2 parts, but I also didn't want to edit 4 hours of content. That would take me like 2 months. So yes, 2 parts, and it's going to be a cliffhanger. Sorry about it. Okay. Did you know that a brutal and tragic mass murder occurred inside the home that renowned architect Frank Lloyd Wright designed and lived in? The legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright is long-lasting, but did you also know that he was a fucking twat? We are going to talk about all of it here today. And as it seems to be for many, greatness and riches can also come with narcissism and tragedy. My parents were fascinated with the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, and as a result, I've been lucky enough to have been inside many of his homes all over the United States. I actually bought this book that I used as a source while visiting Taliesin West in Arizona. It's a great book if you want more detail about this case. It's called Death in a Prairie House by William R. Drennan. It will also be listed in the show notes. If you have not been to a Frank Lloyd Wright home, they are unusual, gorgeous, and a lot of them have a strong reverence for nature. His main philosophy was to bring nature and the surrounding land into his homes, to make the homes almost one with the land on which they were built, which I love as a concept. They're almost otherworldly. His homes are both time capsules, but also have a strange feeling inside of them. It's hard to explain unless you've been to one. They are aesthetically beautiful, but you kind of get a feeling stepping into one of his homes that's almost unsettling. That's just how they make me feel. I don't know if I'm the only one who experiences that, but I don't think unsettling was the intent of the architect. Maybe all the laborious hours spent by one man, all of the obsessive energy poured into every detail of these homes, the manic energy tinged with tragedies of his life. Maybe that is where the feeling comes from, but who knows? Today, we are going to talk about the tragedy that befell the Wright family, and it's truly horrific. I was toying with the idea of only telling you about the murders, but then there's no context of who they happened to and of the scandal that kind of led up to the murders, and it also gives you no idea who Frank Lloyd Wright was. I don't think everyone knows who he is, and the fact that the murders happened at the home of this insanely famous architect, an all-American darling of the 20th century, is kind of an important factor in the story, as well as just being really interesting. So I'm going to give you all the tea, a condensed version of his life leading up to the crimes, the big scandal, and then the murders. Is that okay with you? No? Well, too bad. It's my show. Oh, also, Frank Lloyd Wright has designed so many homes and buildings. He is an architectural legend. I will not be covering his career. That's for architectural scholars to do. We are here for the pearl clutching and the crimes. So if you want to know more about his work specifically, there are tons of books out there, and I suggest you look into it because his buildings are amazing and worth looking into. In the spring and summer of 1911, a house was being built in Spring Green, Wisconsin. The entire town of 730 people were talking about it. Described by its designer as a cottage, it seemed more like a mansion to the local farmers and townspeople, many of which had been put to work on building it. They had been told that the nation's most influential architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, then 44 years old, was building it for his mother, Anna Lloyd Jones Wright. But that was a lie. On September 8th, the Chicago Examiner first broke the story that the house going up across the river was actually intended as a love nest or love cottage for Frank Lloyd Wright and his lover, Mamah Borthwick Cheney. Even the small town of Spring Green knew about Mamah. Frank had already run off with her once before to Europe, deserting his wife Catherine and their 6 children at the time. And now he meant to live in blatant sin with his illicit soulmate just outside of this small, conventional farming village. The town was outraged. Pastors wrote scathing sermons, the local newspaper editor voiced his fury. There was even talk of citizens taking arms and forcibly evicting the couple. Taliesin, as the home would be called, would be the setting of the most horrific single act of mass murder in Wisconsin history. Yes, we all know Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer, both Wisconsin natives, but do you know the name Julian Carlton? Carlton's killings are still shrouded 110 years later in mystery, debate, and evasion. Well, kind of. They were until I wrote this episode. On top of that, the murders involved the century's single most important residential design and the country's most celebrated architect. Scholars have argued that in the wake of the Taliesin murders, Frank Lloyd Wright's designs become remarkably more labyrinthine and more fortress-like. The slaughter at Taliesin may have had a significant influence on American residential design throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Yet biographers dismiss the murders often in just a single paragraph. They're like, I have to write about 4,000 houses that he built and the murders? That's just too much. There are 2 main mysteries that are intertwined here. The first is, why did Frank Lloyd Wright, a champion for domestic virtues, desert his wife Catherine and their 6 children to run off with Mamah Cheney, crippling both his marriage and career with a single blow? The second is, why did Julian Carlton decide to take away everything Wright had left in a frenzy of carnage? One possible answer to the first mystery is that Wright's own father had run off from his own family back in 1884, and Wright never spoke to or saw him again. Or possibly Wright simply experienced a midlife crisis or a nervous breakdown. Or money problems, a perpetual Wright family difficulty. Or maybe, looking deeper, he was afraid of success or any sort of personal and professional equilibrium. Let's start with the father. After he leaves Anna Wright, their 2 young daughters, and their teenage son Frank, history pretty much forgets him. But William Carey Wright himself is also a compelling figure, one who had a greater influence on his famous son than has often been acknowledged. Basically, this man was a fucking Rolling Stone. William Wright was born in New England, an accomplished violin player and organist. He was handsome, charming, and irresponsible with money. Even his loving daughter Lizzie said, quote, he had no financial sense whatsoever, end quote. He dressed with flair and crafted violins by hand. He was a Renaissance man. William had intended to be a preacher like his father, but decided on medicine and law. Well, kind of, like half-assed medicine and half-assed law. After getting married to a woman named Permelia and fathering 3 children, he ended up in Lone Rock, Wisconsin, with the children, but not his wife. He was instantly popular there. He dabbled in law, became the Richland County Circuit Court Commissioner despite any formal credentials, and was named superintendent of the county school district, which he ran for and won. One Wright biographer sees William as among life's darlings. He never met a single person who did not like him. Not at least until he married Anna Lloyd Jones. Anna was from Bear Creek and was one of the teachers now under William's supervision. In her late 20s at this time, Anna was already considered a spinster. Her features were pinched and severe. That's a quote. I didn't say that. She was a fine horsewoman and carried herself in a no-nonsense, masculine way. Also a quote. Like many rural school teachers of the day, Anna herself had little formal education. One writer said that Anna was, quote, half mad, sexually cold, and drearily self-righteous, end quote. But to be fair, many women of warmer, less volatile, less tiresome nature than Anna's might have found William hard to live with. He was in many ways an admirable, gifted man, but his heart would always remain with his first family. He never acquired the knack of making money, and he was constantly on the move, pursued by creditors. William and Anna were married in August of 1866, and the new family moved to the nearby market town of Richland Center, where William was now an ordained Baptist minister. Frank Lloyd Wright was born on June 8, 1867. Frank was immediately and obsessively adored by his mother. Yeah, it's going to turn out real good for Frank. The household included William's 3 children by his first wife, Permelia. P.S. The book didn't say what happened to Permelia. I thought that maybe they got a divorce. I think she's dead at this point. When he ends up with the 3 kids, pretty sure she is deceased. Which were Charles, age 11, George, 9, and Elizabeth Amelia, or Lizzie, age 7. But there would never be a question as to who Anna's favorite child was. In Richland Center, a recurring, predictable pattern in William's life occurs yet again. He charms, he impresses, he enchants, he preaches, and then he leaves. And more important to Anna, he leaves without making money. A biographer observed that William excelled at everything but turning a profit. By the spring of 1869, another child was on the way, and the Wrights moved to McGregor, Iowa, where Jenny was born. The whole family was pinched for cash, but at least she had Frank, whom she doted on almost pathologically. He was destined for great things, she assured him and herself. The family then relocated 3 more times in a short period. Anna is described as a shrew, a stepmother of the brothers Grimm. Anna seems to have singled out Lizzie, William's youngest child by Permelia, as the primary target of her venom. Lizzie recalled in her writings rampant abuse from Anna. Quote, as I grew older, Anna used to tell me that she hated me and all my mother's people. She not only beat me till I was black and blue all over, but threatened me with some terrible things, and especially if I should tell my father about her treatment. One time when he was home and he was in his study, she was frying meat at the stove with a long 2-tined fork. She got at me for something or nothing and grabbed me by the hair and held my head back and jabbed that fork at my face and said she would put my eyes out. I remember one time she was pounding beefsteak with a heavy hardwood roller with sharp ridges all over it, made for the purpose, and she pounded me all over my back with it until I was black and blue and sore, but not bleeding. I could never please her no matter how hard I tried. She admitted sometimes that she hated me and all my mother's relatives. She said she would like to have all of our heads laid over a log and take an axe and chop them off. I do not know whether her mind was right or not. She seemed to have periodical spells when she got mad hysterics and raved like a maniac. Then she would be sick in bed for a day or 2 and I would have peace. End quote. I mean, honestly, that's horrific. And yeah, her sanity is definitely in question. Around this time, William politely asked Anna's brothers if there was a history of insanity in the family. The offended brothers would only say that Anna possessed a most tremendous temper. In 1874, for her own protection, William sent Lizzie to live with her mother's family. Shortly after, his 2 sons by his first wife also left. Anna was pleased, and to her, the Wright children ceased to exist. Anna seems not to have cared much for her 2 daughters by William, while, according to one account, she, quote, appears to have regarded her son as the consequence of a sort of virgin birth, for which she deserved and took all the credit, end quote. In all of his autobiographical writings, which there are a fucking lot of, Frank Wright hardly mentions his sisters, never refers to his 3 step-siblings, and his father is basically dismissed as a sperm donor. Anna then, quote, turned on Frank the full force of her starved emotional needs, end quote, often in disturbing ways. Maginelle, Frank's younger sister, observed that Anna, quote, gathered all the strands of her yearning, wove them together, and fastened them once and for all to her son. He was more than her child. He was her protege, her legacy. He would accomplish what she and her husband could not, end quote. I mean, yick. Your husband and your son are 2 very different relationships. It seems not hard to not confuse the 2. The remaining family then moved to William's father's house in Essex, Connecticut, and then they moved to Massachusetts. 3 years later, an odd thing happened. William abruptly announced that he had become a Unitarian, abandoned his Baptist flock that he was preaching to, and moved his broke-ass family to Madison, Wisconsin, where there was hope for some financial support from Anna's family. I was gonna tell you what a Unitarian is, but it doesn't really fucking matter. Okay? I mean, it's instead of the Holy Trinity, there's one God. Whatever. He makes an abrupt face and changes his entire beliefs on the road to ask for money from Anna's family. William had spent much of his professional lifetime as a preacher, and for him to renounce all of this to embrace his wife's intensely liberal Unitarian beliefs with its specific denial of Christ's divinity is a shocking or at least dramatic step. But whatever his motive, one effect of William's conversion was that he began to see himself primarily as a teacher of music, not of salvation. William set up shop in Madison, then a city of only 25,000, starting his enterprise as a conservatory of music, and offering instruction in voice and in nearly any instrument. Frank by now had his own room, on the door of which he posted stern adolescent warnings such as Sanctum Sanctorum and Keep Out. Frank, always a lackluster student, then dropped out of Madison High School. But an education of a different and more meaningful sort had been opened up to him. For something like 8 straight summers, his Uncle James came to Madison and took Frank off to Helena Valley to make a farmer out of him. Anna hated it, and she even had to cut his long golden curls, which she was very pissed about. Although he would wax poetic about these summers later in life, in reality, James woke Frank up at 4 o'clock in the morning every morning and worked him to exhaustion, so much so that Frank ran away on at least 3 separate occasions. Years later, in a private conversation with an apprentice, he would bluntly sum up his real take on farming. Quote, "It's all pulling tits and shoveling shit." End quote. Which is funny because the older Frank Lloyd Wright was obsessed with writing about nature, and he would capitalize the N in nature and write pages and pages about how amazing nature is, but then behind closed doors, it's pulling tits and shoveling shit. The author of this book says, "But it was a nature to be admiringly observed and philosophized about from a respectful distance, rather than to be intimately experienced on a working Wisconsin farm." Correct. Back at home on Gorham Street, William and Anna's marriage was spiraling out of control towards its inevitable crash. Anna announced that she hated the ground her husband walked on, and she evicted him from the marital bed, relegating him to what he complained was the coldest room in the house. I think he meant that in more ways than one. After at least a year of such treatment, and following some 18 years of marital union that he characterized in his court deposition as unhappy from the start, he also alleged physical abuse at Anna's hands, and William filed for divorce on grounds of desertion. Anna did not contest the action. In fact, some say that William's desertion reflects the ultimate success of a long-term and calculated campaign on Anna's part. Either way, William packed the few possessions he could carry with him, mainly a bunch of violins, and left the Madison house and Anna and their 3 children. Frank records that he never spoke to or saw William again. Maginal asked her mother what she should tell inquisitive neighbors about her father's disappearance. Anna's reply was, "Say that he is dead." Ouch. William spent the remainder of his days teaching music in various Midwestern states. And I like to think he was finally happy. He died at his son Charles's house near Pittsburgh in 1904. His body was transported back to Lone Rock to lie beside Permelia, the wife he had never stopped loving. Frank Lloyd Wright did not attend his funeral. It's eerie to observe how that same pattern plays itself out once more in the life of William's son, Frank Lloyd Wright. Fun little sidebar, one of the things that you notice first about a Wright home is how tiny everything is. William, Frank's dad, was a tiny man, and Frank himself was a tiny, tiny man. So Frank drafted his residential designs with reference to what he called, quote, the human scale, by which he meant his own teeny, teeny, tiny stature. So visitors to Taliesin and basically every other Frank Lloyd Wright home are always bumping their heads on beams, moldings, on the roofs. One biographer correctly charges Wright with committing, quote, psychological blackmail upon anyone taller than he, end quote. Frank and his father, besides being tiny men, they also shared a cavalier attitude towards money. Frank spent a lifetime either avoiding creditors or charming them into submission. There's a bunch of examples in the book. He would literally just get on the phone and talk people out of making him pay them. Another example was that there was at one point literally a sheriff living in the children's playroom because he owed so much money to someone that he had to be like supervised and made sure that he didn't run off. So the sheriff just was like, I guess I'm living here until you pay it. I'm sure he talked his way out of that one too, though. Frank and William also shared an overinflated sense of self-assurance and evangelical natures. Frank indeed would come to see his profession as a kind of prophetic, semi-priestly calling, similar to his father's call to a variety of Baptist pulpits. And both were shitty fathers. Years later, in the wake of deserting his own 6 children, Frank said, "I never had the father feeling." Elsewhere, he says that his real children were his buildings and that he detested the word papa. As an adult, his son John remarked, "I often wonder now why he didn't leave us sooner." Finally, one last similarity. It may be that there was one favored woman in each of their lives. For William, it was Permelia, beside whom he had himself buried in the little village of Lone Rock. For Frank, it was Mama Booten Borthwick. Sorry. Mama Booten Borthwick? What in the fucking hell? That's a fucking name. Frank had himself buried near Mama on the grounds of a chapel in the very shadow of the Taliesin house that he had built for her and where she had so hideously died. After the divorce of his parents, Frank passionately championed his mother's cause. He must have been aware of her mistreatment of Permelia's children and of the calculated cruelties she inflicted upon William. Frank was smart enough to have witnessed all of this, but he was firmly on her side. They're a little terror couple, and he backed her the entire way. And then, quarter century later, he did the exact same thing and abandoned his entire family. Frank embraced Anna's distorted version of events so that he could portray her, however inaccurately, as a heroic martyr, sacrificed on the altar of society's narrow moral sensibilities. In his eyes, just as Anna had suffered during her persecution, which, bunch of bullshit, so had he been publicly condemned for doing what he felt was right in the desertion of his wife and children in 1909. Just as she had been punished, air quotes, for her courage, so had he been ostracized for acting openly and honestly. As Wright saw it, he and his mother had suffered similar unjust fates. Identifying with Anna's interpretation of her marital difficulties gave him a crutch to lean on during his own shitty actions. Much has been made about how little formal education Frank Lloyd Wright received. So he dropped out of high school. He always claimed to have left the University of Wisconsin in his senior year, but that was a lie. He only attended a year, most likely, in 1886. And he studied engineering there, not architecture. He did some construction work on the campus's science hall, and he claimed to have witnessed the collapse of a wing of the nearby state capitol building, which had been erected on a foundation of shitty materials. If so, Wright learned that lesson well. When the Kanto earthquakes of 1922 and 1923 leveled much of Tokyo, the Wright-designed Imperial Hotel held firm. And when his Midway Gardens in Chicago was torn down, the contractors hired for the purpose went broke because the building was so hard to tear down. A university dean and professor of civil engineering, Alan D. Conover, hired Frank as a laborer at the Science Hall's site. More importantly, he also taught him the basics of drafting and some elementary principles of engineering. Frank Lloyd Wright was now prepared to commence his architectural career. In 1887, he set out for Chicago, which had become a mecca for ambitious architects from around the country ever since the Great Fire of 1871 had gutted the city. Very much his father's son, he left behind a flock of Madison creditors. Anna wanted Frank close to home and continuing his studies. She fired off a flurry of letters begging him to return to Madison, predicting that in Chicago, Frank would merely, quote, waste himself on fine clothes and girls, end quote. Frank was like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And he refused to come home. Soon enough, though, Anna packed up her daughters and took the train to Chicago to find Frank and keep an eye on him. By late 1887, she was once again living with Frank. You think they fucked? I'm just saying. Before long, Frank was frequenting expensive restaurants, revamping his wardrobe, and, as in Madison, living massively beyond his means. Wright signed on as a draftsman with the great Louis Henry Sullivan, the father of the skyscraper, ultimately securing a 5-year exclusive contract. As part of the arrangement, Wright was asked to agree that he would not leverage his new position in order to moonlight or bootleg his own residential designs during off hours, as so many young architects were doing. Frank promised that he would not, and at that time he may have even meant it. Frank worked ferociously until the day his own drawings had become indistinguishable from Sullivan's. He quickly assumed the title of his master's favorite, a fact so self-evident and so rankling to the firm's other draftsmen that it prompted fistfights and even a knife fight in the studio. Frank took pride in occupying an office that adjoined Sullivan's. He asked for raises and got them, becoming, at $60 a week, the highest-paid draftsman in Chicago, and by 1889, the practice's chief designer. This relationship between Sullivan and Wright was a little weird. Sullivan's enthusiasm for his new protege, who he called his other self, was gay as shit. Just kidding. Was on the erotic side. Wright was attractive and charming and young, and Sullivan harbored distinctly homosexual leanings. But Wright was a painfully shy virgin. He was a virgin who couldn't drive. Anna had taught him that sexual contact of any kind was a contamination. Except for her vagina. I'm sure that was fine for him to... Never mind. Nonetheless, Wright learned a lot during this period of time. He soaked up knowledge like a little sponge, and he grew his career rapidly. It was an education that lasted him a lifetime and that changed the American residential landscape forever. In 1893, he and Sullivan acrimoniously broke off their relationship over Wright's bootlegging a number of residential designs on his own time. Sullivan felt personally as well as professionally betrayed. His confrontation with Wright resembled, quote, a lover's quarrel, end quote. This happened in front of a bunch of other people that worked there, and all of them were like, yeah, they looked like lovers having a fight. But Wright knew a sinking ship when he saw it, and he was cutting the line. Once the star among Chicago architects, Sullivan was down and out by 1909. With the future blank, he wrote in a letter to Wright, "I am surely living in hell." He died in 1924, an utterly broke alcoholic. Towards the end of his life, he was reduced to begging handouts from his former disciple, Frank. Enter red-haired Catherine Lee Tobin, Kitty to her friends. She was vivacious, bright, charmingly opinionated, refined, and rich. And despite her precocity, Catherine was perfectly willing to submit herself to the will and needs of the man she happened to marry, however narcissistic he might prove to be. She aimed to be the perfect Victorian wife. Wright had first spotted her at his uncle's church in 1887, the same year he started working for Sullivan. He met her formally at a dinner and dance. He literally collided with Catherine as he ran toward a group of friends, knocking foreheads with her, both of them falling to the floor. It's like a fucking rom-com in this bitch. The next anyone knew, she was saving him a seat beside her at the church, and the two were never seen apart. She was only 16, a student at Hyde Park High School. Before you're like, ew, he's only 20, and also back then, they used to marry girls off at like 9. She's like already a spinster. Frank indicated that he planned to marry her. His mother was determined that no such thing should happen. It seems she was not willing to share her son with any other woman. Totally healthy and normal. But Catherine was a prize catch. She was beautiful, intelligent, moneyed, and was several social steps above the struggling young architect who, only a few years before, had been little more than a Wisconsin farmhand with a knack for design. And Kitty was no dim-witted debutante. She was sensible enough to discern Frank's flippant disregard for practical matters. For example, she immediately took steps towards getting his finances in order, at least for a while. Her love for Frank was authentic and passionate. Frank had long dreamed of an ideal mate. This guy wrote all the time, and a lot of it's very annoying. This is annoying. He wrote that he wanted, quote, an intimate fairy princess, and a muse and selfless helpmate. Okay, Frank. You really are a virgin. Also, you have your mom, okay? You get her. I don't know what she is and all that, but like, that's what you get. Just kidding, he also gets Kitty. And Kitty's a fucking catch. Basically, he was looking for someone who would unconditionally adore him, just like his mommy does. Naturally, Anna, over the next 2 years, repeatedly attempted to sabotage the relationship. But Frank saw through it. Desperate now, Anna alerted Catherine's parents, who shipped their daughter off to northern Michigan for several months. But it was all for nothing. Frank and Catherine were married on June 1st, 1889. Wright was a week shy of 22 years old, and Catherine just barely 18. It rained all day, the day of their wedding. Catherine's father wept during the ceremony, and Anna fainted. They returned to Chicago, where Frank wanted to build a house. He and his new bride were living with Anna and Frank's sisters, and his mother had already begun abusing Catherine with the same vigor that she had abused Lizzie years before. Poor Kitty, Maginell later said, she didn't deserve so forcible an adversary as my mother. Frank seems to have done absolutely fucking nothing to block any of Anna's nasty assaults on his new wife. When he was away at work, Catherine took to hiding in closets. Anna then sold her Madison house for cash and decided to move next door to Frank and Kitty's new home. The house was finished by the early spring of 1890, just in time for the birth of the couple's first child, Lloyd. For Wright, however, no house was ever truly finished. He kept tinkering with the design, never quite able to leave it alone. He obsessed over the placement of the furniture, constantly moving it around for just the right effect. Later, as more children arrived, he added a vaulted playroom, then, in 1898, a separate drafting studio. The residence grew, becoming a laboratory for many of Wright's experiments in domestic architecture. Construction costs, of course, were wildly over budget. This tendency on Wright's part to exceed, or actually to pretty much entirely ignore, projected costs would recur constantly over the next 19 years, during which time Frank built 29 homes for his frequently irritated Oak Park neighbors. But despite this, the owners of these homes could not get around the fact that the residences he built for them were beautiful. Quote, "It is like living within a work of art," end quote, gushed one customer. The streets of Oak Park evolved into a virtual museum of Wright's architecture. True to her promise, Anna moved into an existing Gothic Revival cottage just around the corner. And predictably, her torment of Catherine picked up seamlessly from where it had left off. One biographer writes, quote, "As a child bride, Kitty was no match for her calculating mother-in-law. One of the most difficult aspects of marriage for Kitty must have been living next door to the one person who everyone knew would always try to drive a wedge between her son and any woman perceived as a rival." End quote. Catherine, nonetheless, played the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law. She set up a kindergarten in their new house. She joined clubs, involved herself in various civic causes, and earned herself a reputation as the perfect wife, mother, and hostess. There were problems, of course. Anna's incessant meddling, the pains of repeated childbirths, rumors of infidelities, and Frank's penchant for spending more than he brought in. Still, Catherine was permitted about a decade and a half of relative marital happiness, but no more than that. And when the end finally came, it was terrible. By this point, Frank and Catherine had 6 children together. Lloyd, John Lloyd, Catherine, David, Francis, and son Llewellyn. Everyone says Frank was a great father, despite his own admissions he never wanted to be a father. He played the piano, hosted clam bakes, played with the children in the gigantic playroom, and was always seen with them in his front yard. Clients and other admirers were welcomed into the extended family circle. The Oak Park house was filled with noise and laughter, and son John remembered his father as, quote, "an epic of wit and merriment that gave our home the feeling of a jolly carnival. There were parties somewhere all of the time, and everywhere some of the time. It was just fun to have him about," end quote. One neighbor said, "If that fellow Wright doesn't stop having children, he'll overcrowd this town." So, despite his later dismissive comments about fatherhood, Frank seemed to have entered into domestic suburban life willingly. While Catherine ran her kindergarten and household, Frank competed in horse shows, affiliated himself with exclusive organizations for the local literati, designed golf and tennis clubhouses, and accumulated speeding tickets by driving through the town in his specially modified Stoddard Dayton sports car, nicknamed the Yellow Devil. Frank was held in high esteem by his neighbors, and home life appeared to suit Frank Lloyd Wright. Inscribed on the fireplace mantel of the Heath House is a quote by Wright himself, written in 1905. "The reality of the house is order. The blessing of the house is community. The glory of the house is hospitality. The crown of the house is godliness." His allegiance to home and family, or the opulent outward appearance of it, has been argued to be the entirety of Wright's architectural philosophy. He is the very first momfluencer. The idea that a house was a palpable expression of marital fidelity and domesticity. Their union and the house itself were sacred things, sacraments that fostered such virtues as discipline, sacrifice, and self-control. Wright based his entire life's work on this philosophy, as well as his very well curated public image. The living room where the family comes together is the center of the house, and that's what his architecture was about. That's what he preached to everyone. That's his image was being a husband and father. It all tied together, right? But then, in 1909, he abandoned his wife and 6 children and ran off to Europe with the neighbor lady. But if Wright's sudden departure from domestic life was astonishing on moral and philosophical grounds, it also made no sense for his career. In abandoning his Oak Park family, Wright also threw out his architectural practice, so painstakingly put together over the course of 22 years. One observer pointed out, Wright was conquering the profession and there seemed to be nothing on the horizon, not even a tiny cloud, to indicate that his fortunes might change. In 1901, Wright published an article in Ladies' Home Journal announcing the idea of the Prairie House. He described it as a functional and aesthetic breakthrough, one that aimed to preserve and strengthen proper family living. Frank's success was grounded in his grand conceptions of the Prairie House specifically, and of what he called organic architecture. Not that these ideas were entirely original to Wright, for the record. The floor plan of a prairie home was intended to promote convenience, freedom of movement, and togetherness, and the house itself should be so much a part of the ground on which it stood that it would seem to dissolve into the landscape itself. At this time, however, Wright was feeling stifled. He had 6 loud-ass, sticky-ass children. He built himself a studio that was separate from the family home, but not even that could keep them, A, quiet, and B, away from him. Quote, things began to smash, he wrote later. Cries to resound, shrieks, quarrels, and laughter. Destruction of something or other happened every minute, end quote. It didn't help that local creditors hounded him endlessly. Suburban life itself, once a goal to be achieved and celebrated, now seemed oppressive to him. And on top of that, Catherine bored him. She was no longer the golden girl of the 1890s. She had made the fatal error of becoming a wife and mother. While her love for and devotion to Frank remained strong, the demands of child rearing and Oak Park social life had left her, Frank said, intellectually moribund. That's in quotes. He literally said that she was intellectually moribund, which means dead. Get so fucked, Frank. He straight up would say publicly that she was too involved in being a housewife and a mother. That's your wife and the mother of your children. Like, that's exactly what you wanted her to do. And then she was like, yeah, I'll do that for you. And now you're mad? Ugh, I can't. And now you have a problem. He's such a dick. Catherine remained content with her life. She had a successful husband, 6 healthy children, and a beautiful home. That was enough for her. That was not enough for fucking Frank. Increasingly restless, he borrowed some money in 1905 and sailed to Japan with Catherine and another couple. This is where Frank gets into Japanese architecture, which is a huge influence on his career in the future. The wife of the other couple discovered that her husband and Frank had been cavorting in a Tokyo bathhouse and was furious at both of them. She didn't speak to Wright again for 38 years. That's my kind of gal. By the time they came home, cracks in Frank's marriage, deniable before, were beginning to appear clearly to everyone, possibly even to Catherine herself. Already a bit suspect in the eyes of his conventional neighbors, Frank was becoming less and less the model citizen. He let his hair grow long. He affected flamboyant dress like his father used to. He now fancied himself an artiste. By suburban standards, guests at his house became ever more exotic and even bizarre, and Wright stopped going to church. I mean, honestly, this all sounds like a classic midlife crisis, but like the rich and famous version, of course. We all see it coming, don't we? We know what's going to happen next. He wants his dick sucked by some new. Later, he was repeatedly seen barreling around Oak Park in his stupid yellow sports car in the company of his clients' wives. Rumors were flying. Frank was only conducting business, Catherine told herself and everyone else. Most often with Frank in his small dick sports car was Mama Borthwick Cheney, recalled as handsome, intellectual, lively, and cosmopolitan. I don't know about all that, but okay. Mama was 2 years younger than Frank and born in Boone, Iowa. You know those cosmopolitan Boone, Iowa-ins? Everyone knows about that. She met her future husband And no, we are not talking about Frank, her actual ass husband. She met him at the University of Michigan, where she received a master's degree in teaching and then worked as a librarian for 5 years. A son, John, was born in 1902, followed by a daughter, Martha, 4 years later. She and husband, Edwin, decided to build a house. And like so many of their neighbors before them and after them, they consulted the local legend, Frank Lloyd Wright. Mayma met Frank through Kitty. They were both members of Oak Park's 19th century women's club and were frequently mentioned together on the social pages of the town newspaper. In 1903, the year that Llewellyn, the last child by Kitty, was born, Wright began plans for the Cheney residence on nearby Northeast Avenue. Friends of the Cheney children reported seeing Frank and Mayma spooning on the library couch. Prairie houses were designed, after all, for promoting family unity, not for concealing suburban adultery. An alarming irony is at work here. Wright had designed a family values type house for a family unit that he was about to destroy. How early the affair actually began is hard to say. One probable account has it that Wright was infatuated with Mayma at first glance, and that the 1905 Tokyo trip represented a last-ditch attempt by the other couple that they were friends with to persuade Wright against having a potentially ruinous affair. But whenever the sexual relationship started, by 1909, Frank and Mayma were openly sharing the great news of their love with their respective spouses. And Frank asked Catherine for a divorce. Apparently, Mayma's husband took all of this very well. Maybe he was intimidated by Wright, but honestly, he's just a really stoic dude who doesn't talk. Catherine, however, was shook. She asked Frank for 1 year of grace. If he still wanted a divorce after that time period was up, she said she would grant him one. Privately, in letters to friends, she desperately hoped for and confidently anticipated an eventual return and reconciliation. That didn't happen. At the height of his success at this point in time, Wright's abandonment of his practice and of his wife and 6 children was justly being called, quote, a conundrum that defies analysis, end quote. Many speculated that Wright was undergoing a nervous breakdown, a classic mentee B, but a Wright scholar suggests that Frank was a victim of his own success, that his work, while widely admired, was being reduced to a type or a style, rather than being correctly appreciated as a distinct and complex American response to fundamental social and cultural questions. Increasingly, he saw himself as a free spirit, as a creative artist who had earned the right to take liberties with rules and customs, including the narrow rules of suburban life and the custom of marriage itself. He's better than everyone. He can do whatever he wants. And I'm not saying that. He says that repeatedly, publicly, repeatedly. We'll get to it. Others make note of Wright's lifelong tendency to invent emergencies when they failed to develop of their own accord. Perhaps the man simply could not tolerate any sort of equilibrium in his life or in his life's work. You would think the best potential witness is Wright himself as to why he did this, but he is not a reliable narrator, that is for sure. When he's not wildly defending himself, he's very evasive on the subject. He adopts a tone of helpless puzzlement. He kind of, rhetorically throws his hands up and he says, quote, because I did not know what I wanted to go away. What I wanted, I did not know. I loved my children. I loved my home. A true home is the finest ideal of man. And yet, to gain freedom, I asked for a divorce. End quote. The fuck? You're an idiot. The decision threatened to tear him apart, he said, but he found relief by riding out in the countryside with his horse and reading poetry. That's what he said. Like, no, you were fucking Mayma, but okay. I hate this man. It's the age-old debate. I love the art, but I don't love the artist. He's a fucking dickless little twat. Anyways, he then switches his reasoning completely, leaning on Mayma's favorite philosopher, Ellen Key, a Swedish feminist whose works Mayma had been translating. In these books written by Kay, Frank discovers that his desertion of wife and children, far from constituting an act of betrayal, actually reflects loyalty to a number of lofty ethical principles, among them the notion that marriage, not mutual, is worse than any other form of slavery, and, in fact, was indecent and barbarous. Marriage is a mere civil contract between a man and woman, and therefore subject to cancellation on either side, once the knot of true love unravels into a less than mutual relationship. This is what this lady's writing about. Mayma's reading it to Frank, and Frank is like, oh yeah, I'm just going to say that. Frank needed an alternative worldview that would serve to vindicate his decision to leave Kitty and the children. Ultimately, one answer as to why he deserted Kitty is simply because he wanted to and there was nothing to prevent him from doing so. Only in leaving his wife, Frank tried to convince everyone, he could fulfill his highest moral obligation, that of being true to himself. The bald fact is that he wanted to have sex with Mayma Chaney, but Wright claims that that was merely tangential and occasional. According to his moral arithmetic, if he wanted to live openly with Mayma, and if society forbade such a union, then society was wrong. He honestly wondered why others, Kitty and the children for example, failed to understand the logic in it all. Wright's embrace of Key's philosophies is bullshit and intended only to mitigate the guilt he felt at his own selfishness. Only a fucking monster would have failed to feel a large measure of guilt for what he did. So he invented a comfortable new set of rules for himself that was complementary to his character and embraced the belief system wholeheartedly. It is also probable that Wright felt no guilt at all. He was a fucking narcissist and possibly a sociopath. And everything he does from here on out shows that he felt nothing at all. His mother, Anna, after all, had suffered similar difficulties following her divorce back in 1885. She too had been resolute in her determination. Again, this is Frank's take on it. To live her life in accordance with her own vision, and it stood up to the resulting scandal. Anna, if no one else, would understand. I go to the cross, Frank whined after deciding to leave his entire family. But he knew he wouldn't have to go alone, and Mommy Dearest would always be there for him. The logistics of Frank leaving his family leaves questions. It can be argued as well-calculated planning or as spontaneous chaos. I will tell you what it was. It was well-calculated planning. To finance his escape, he borrowed money on all sides, collecting advances on commissions from Chicago clients and pawning fistfuls of his precious Japanese prints. As for the studio itself, he simply gave it away. One biographer said, quote, "Perhaps that was not a day for rational decisions," end quote. I think he didn't give a single fuck and just wanted to cavort around Europe with a new woman. That job done, Wright stopped home to announce his abrupt departure to a tearful Catherine. He turned to his son David, then 13, and told him he was now the man of the house. He left the boy with a grocery bill for $900. When interviewed 70 years later, David was still fucking pissed. This just shows you exactly what kind of man Frank was. This one detail. He didn't give a single fuck about his entire family or his wife. Or his bills. Nothing. Except Mayma's vagina and fame. It only took the press a week to track him down after he left. And when they found him, the story set off shockwaves back in Chicago. On Sunday, November 7th, the Chicago Tribune published a sensational scandal. The Tribune's Berlin correspondent was poring over registers of hotels, particularly the Hotel Adlon, where he found that a Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright and wife were registered there. And no, they're not talking about Kitty, and wife refers to Mayma. It was true. Kitty had already sent Frank a postcard there containing a message that managed to be both pitiful and assertive all at the same time. It said, quote, "My dear, we think of you often and hope you are well and enjoying life, as you have so longed to. From the children and your wife, Catherine L. Wright." On the other side of the postcard was a photo of a church that Frank had helped build, Unity Temple, and the church that they were married at. A horde of reporters then descended on Catherine's Oak Park doorstep. With a minister by her side, Kitty was ready for them. Did you think Kitty would be caught sleeping? No. Did you think she was too demure and sweet to handle a giant scandal? Oh, no, no, no. Kitty is the tactful, dutiful wife, but she's also a bad bitch. She handled herself with dignity, issuing a shrewdly conciliatory statement, her voice breaking only on occasion. Quote, "My heart is with him now. He will come back as soon as he can. I have faith in Frank Lloyd Wright that passeth understanding, perhaps, but I know him as no one else knows him. In this instance, he is as innocent of wrongdoing as I am. He is honest in everything he does. A moment's insecurity tortures him more than anything in the world. Frank Wright has never deceived me in all of his life. Whatever I am as a woman, aside from my good birth, I owe to the example of my husband. I shall make no appeal whatever to the courts. I stand by my husband right at this moment. I am his wife. He loves his children tenderly and has the greatest anxiety for their welfare. I feel certain that he will come back when he has reached a certain decision with himself. When he comes back, we will be as it has been." End quote. Regarding Mayma, Catherine was notably less appeasing. Miss Cheney, she said, was, quote, "simply a force against which we have to contend, and someone who had bewitched, blameless, unsuspecting Frank with her queer ideas." Disregarding the fact of her own former friendship with Mayma, Kitty said, quote, "I never felt that I breathed the same air with her. It was simply a case of a vampire. You have heard of such things." End quote. The press tried to get an interview from poor Edwin, that's Mayma's husband, but he only said, quote, "I don't care to talk about this matter at all." End quote. Edwin hates talking. Same, Edwin. Why do I have a podcast? Just kidding. I don't hate talking on here. Just in real life. Local clergy, however, were talking. They were talking shit. Like I am 110 years later. In a sermon entitled Affinity Fools, a reverend mixed together a number of barnyard images, finally likening Frank and Mayma in their passion to, quote, "an old setting hen. Inevitably, one day there is a splash, and both have tumbled into the same old hog pen where thousands have tumbled before them." If you have gone down into the refrigerating rooms of a big packing house and looked at a row of pigs' faces hanging on their hooks, you have seen a perfect picture of Affinity Fools unmasked. End quote. Sir, are you okay? Meanwhile, carefree Frank and Mayma, oblivious to the commotion they were causing, were fucking their way across Europe. Frank had been staying with Mayma in her Berlin apartment whenever he came to the city. Now he brought her back with him to Italy, where he was working, to his cream-colored villa above Florence. Years later, he remembered their life together there. Quote, "How many souls seeking release from real or fancied domestic woes have sheltered on the slopes below Fiesole. I, too, now sought shelter there in companionship with her who, by force of rebellion as by way of love, was then implicated with me. Walking hand in hand together up the hill road from the Firenze to the older town, all along the way in the sight and scent of roses by day. Walking arm in arm up the same old road at night, listening to the nightingale in the deep shadows on the moonlit wood, trying hard to hear the song in the deeps of life." End quote. Frank, now free of family duties and a wife, was happy. He and Mayma were inseparable. In a letter to a friend a few months earlier, he was ambivalent about the Oak Park desertion and his relationship with Mayma. Quote, "I think you will believe that I would do nothing I did not believe to be right. But I have believed a terrible thing to be right, and have sacrificed it to those who loved me and my work in what must seem a selfish, cruel waste of life and purpose. I have never loved Catherine, my wife, as she deserved. I have for some years loved another. I took her with me when I sailed for Germany. I cannot ask others to countenance the thing I believe to be right when I know it may Yes, it must seem wrong to them. What a traitor I must seem to the trust that has been placed in me, my home, friends, and not least the cause of architecture. I wanted to square my life with myself. I want to live true as I would build true. And in the light I have tried to do this thing. End quote. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice. I am so over this man and his fucking writings and his fucking justifications for his horrible behavior. Shut the fuck up, Frank. This is classic Wright. His old argument that open adultery is somehow more honest and true than a clandestine affair. But what do we make of the statement, I have believed a terrible thing to be right? Does Frank think that his affair with Mema is the terrible thing? A mistake? Or is he merely confessing that the consequences of his acts have been terrible to others, family, friends, and clients, but not necessarily to himself? I think he doesn't give a single fuck about what any of those people feel or think about him, and he is only talking about himself. In either case, he does seem to imply that possibly the bloom was off the Florentine roses and that a terrible gamble had been taken or lost. Or, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe the letter represented a long, calculated campaign, outlines of which were already taking shape in Wright's head. A plan that, if successful, would lead him back to the Midwest and ultimately to a rural villa built just for Mema, which is exactly what happens, so yes, calculated. Within a few months, he was again writing his friends, this time to announce that, quote, the fight has been fought. I am going back to Oak Park to pick up the thread of my work and in some degree of my life where I snapped it. I am going to work among the ruins, not as any woman's husband, but as the father of the children, to do what I can for them. But I have been cruel. I have hardness in my soul. I have destroyed many beautiful things in the hope of putting better things in their place. End quote. It sounds like finally one little shred of him feeling bad, but I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that this is a lie. He is spinning this whole fucking fabrication that he cares about the kids and blah, 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 wants to put his life back together. No. He wants to move back to the United States with Mema and be with her and never see his family again. But he wants to make everyone think he's a good person and be friends with him again. And also cover his tracks. So listen, I'm just saying, don't fall for his bullshit. He's full of shit, this guy. He's really a fucking dickless twat. He then sat down and wrote to Catherine, spelling out the conditions for his return. Those stipulations were that he and Catherine would no longer share marital relations, but that they would at least be together and put up a good front for the sake of his children. And, of fucking course, more importantly, put on a good front for his work. Further, he would give up Mema. Listen, that's a fucking lie. But he tells her, I'm not going to be with her. Still, he told Catherine that he feared by staying with Mema that he would grow to loathe her. That's also a lie. Then he wrote a long defensive letter to Anna, excusing his actions on the grounds that his family had failed, quote, to give him emotional support in his time of need. I dread the aspect my return must wear, end quote. Then he said, quote, I am the prodigal whose return is a triumph for the institutions, all capitalization. I have outraged a weak son who, infatuated sexually, has had his passion drained and therefore his courage, and so abandoning the source of his infatuation to whatever fate may hold for her, probably a hard, lonely struggle in the face of a world that writes her down as an outcast to be shunned, or a craven return to another man. This would be Edwin, her husband. His prostitute for a roof and a bed and a chance to lose her life and her children, while I return to my dear wife and children who all along knew I would and welcomed by my friends with open rejoicing and secret contempt. Why must this be so? I enclosed the letter written a week or more ago to Catherine, telling her the basis upon which I wish to come to my work and the children. I think it is well you should know of it. End quote. How typical of Wright to assume that he should share with his mother the most intimate details of his married life. This fucking man baby. To blow your own life up and then cry about it to your mommy. He's a fucking loser. Next, he took his prostitute to Paris, left her there, and sailed for the U.S. I mean, he referenced her as a prostitute, not me. Just saying. Quote, Mr. Wright reached here Saturday evening, and he has brought many beautiful things. Everything but his heart, I guess. That he has left in Germany, end quote. Catherine wrote to her friend. Understandably, Kitty was feeling sorry for herself. Frank appeared suddenly in Oak Park. He slinked back in under the cover of night on October 8th, 1910, and the town was stunned. This is the only shit talking I could find, but it's really funny. The only quote in this whole part is, quote, Wright was dressed to closely resemble the man on the Quaker Oats package, end quote, wrote a former client. Amazing, let him have it. Women turned aside as he passed them on the street, and former friends crossed the road to avoid him. The local Presbyterian minister was preparing a sermon in which an adulterous man was portrayed as one who has lost all sense of morality and religion and is damnably to be blamed. Frank had a friend pick him up at the shipyard or whatever the fuck and drive him back to Oak Park, and he told that friend, I may as well admit that I am a social outcast. However, this friend said that Wright, quote, evidenced but little signs that he himself is ready to eat any humble pie, end quote. This return has signs of a grand scheme. First, enough time had passed so that Mayma could get a divorce from Edwin on the grounds of her own desertion. Secondly, he had found a benefactor to pay for his new life. Within 4 days of his return, Frank was writing to this benefactor, a wealthy brother of a friend, playing the role of a reformed sinner to a T. And of course, he also asked for a loan. He said he needed money to renovate the Oak Park house and to pay off the debt that would free up his valuable collection of Japanese prints. Over the course of the next 2 months, the man coughed up over $25,000. A staggering amount of money back then. Today, that would be around $850,000. Also, in case you couldn't predict, the money was not used to renovate the Oak Park house. I bet you could guess what it was for. Well, he had told this benefactor that the Oak Park house needed to be made into apartments so that Catherine could have a rental income and take care of the children. He talked this benefactor into giving him a trust deed loan. However, the benefactor soon discovered that Frank, employing a favorite tactic of his, had already sold off partial equity in the house to a variety of people, thereby creating an intraceable tangle of legal knots. Also, he's not remodeling it to be apartments so Catherine can live. He doesn't care about her or the kids. He's also selling off her house that she lives in with the kids out from underneath her. Also, during this time, Frank got the same man to pay the mortgage on a house for his mother, Anna. And he got Anna to buy him a parcel of land. Can you guess what the land will be used for? Using this man's money, Frank bought back his Japanese prints, his precious fucking prints, and then he sold them again for over $20,000. All of this being done, his vow to Catherine was now out the fucking window, and instead, he hurried to the coast and jumped on the first ship he could find that would take him back to Mayma. When he returned once more to Oak Park in early 1911, the intricate campaign was entering its final stages. He had Mommy Dearest buy him the parcel of land on which he was to build his prostitute, she's not a prostitute, but he said that, a new home. Meanwhile, Mayma returned to Oak Park, but not to Edwin, her husband, whom she sued for divorce that August after being gone for 2 years. And that was enough time for legal desertion on her part. But she's also suing him when he didn't do anything. Edwin didn't contend any of this. He was just like, sure. He was also awarded the children, which suited Mayma just fine. Actually, one of the things that had most attracted Frank to Mayma was her complete indifference towards her own children, who they were basically not really ever in her care, but when they were, she would ship them off to boarding school. Unlike Kitty, she had largely freed herself from her offspring to pursue a life of luxury. Basically, she and Frank are two asshole peas in one big asshole pod. So next, he needs this love shack. He goes to work straight away on Taliesin, which has also been called Wright's architectural self-portrait and also his alter ego. Quote, I began to build Taliesin to get my back against the wall and fight for what I saw I had to fight. End quote. The defensive language is appropriate. One of several ways to look at Taliesin is as a fortress within which two errant lovers could barricade themselves against a hostile and deeply suspicious outer world. It is no accident, for example, that the house is positioned on a hill, as opposed to in the valley, or that its interior design provides a panoramic view of the countryside all around. It would be hard for anyone to approach Taliesin without being seen. Frank would call Taliesin a prairie house, but Taliesin was not a farm at all. It was an estate. It was a rich man's estate. And Frank didn't have any money. It is possible to see Taliesin as a symbol. Wright himself invites such an interpretation. Quote, hill and house should live together, each the happier for the other. Yes, there was a house that Hill might marry and live happily ever after. End quote. This perfect organic union between hill and home was definitely intended to reflect Frank's union with Mema, the woman for whom he said Taliesin had first taken form. And of course, Wright had himself in mind in the house's symbolism as well. Significantly, the domestic hearth is not on Taliesin's central axis. This is in every prairie house. That's like his thing, is where the family gets together, is the axis of the house. In this one, the living room is the center, surrounded by windows and suggesting a free-floating suspension in open air. The aesthetic argument seems to be that here the individual was now central, shedding the family unit. Frank's grandson, Frank Lloyd Wright, would later confirm that Taliesin for his grandfather was a sanctuary, and that to him it was a sacred thing that was happening there. That is decidedly not how the local people saw it, nor did they see Taliesin as a fortress, a prairie house, an ideal, or a symbol. When Frank moved in permanently in December of 1911, the residents of Spring Green tended to regard Taliesin as merely a house in which Frank Lloyd Wright and Mema Borthwick were shacking up, however elegant the shack. Close neighbors were furious. A Chicago reporter fanned the flames of local hostility, claiming that he had spotted Frank carrying Mema in his arms as they forded a stream on the property, Mema displaying, quote, a good deal of lingerie of a quality not often on display in that part of Wisconsin, end quote. Confronted with the news back in Oak Park, a tearful Catherine denied that any of this could possibly be true. Through her daughter, Catherine, who had become the family spokesperson, she issued a simple statement to the press. Quote, just say for Mr. Wright and Mrs. Wright and all the little Wrights that we don't know anything about this awful story and that it must be untrue, end quote. But it was true. And Frank finally decided that it was time to talk with the local people. He would explain himself to them. He would explain everything. He chose, of all days, Christmas Day, to summon a reporter from the Chicago Tribune to Taliesin. In this interview, he was standing in front of a gigantic fireplace with a fire roaring away. Frank greeted the reporter. Mema was sitting nearby, wrapped in an oriental gown. Wright himself wore a bright crimson robe, which was an unfortunate choice given the occasion. Following a few polite pleasantries, Frank prepared to read his polished statement. Going into the presentation, he must have calculated that he had every reason to be confident. After all, during his years abroad with Mema, he had been reading his lover's translations of Ellen Key and her insights into marital slavery and the joys of free love. He set out to deliver a rational and persuasive justification of his behavior to Chicago and his less enlightened Spring Green neighbors. It did not go well. Frank told the Tribune reporter that his marital breakup was the fault of Anna and Catherine's parents. He and Kitty had been much too young to marry back in '89 and should have been prevented from doing so. It was convenient for him to leave out the part where both sets of parents, deeply disapproved of their marriage. His wife and he were two entirely different personalities, he said, and over the years their differences have become tragically evident. Catherine lived for the children, while he lived for his buildings. He continued that his abandonment of his children would prove to be good for them in the long run. If he had stayed at home in Oak Park, he would have molded his children in his own likeness. And now they were free from his dominant personality, with, quote, room in which to grow up to be themselves. When they get a little older, I hope they will see me in another light. Wright said that by leaving, he had spared the children the, quote, coldness and falsehood in the atmosphere they breathed. I haven't abandoned my children or deserted any woman, nor have I eloped with any man's wife, end quote. All this, of course, I'm sure was news to Edwin and Catherine. He then says, Mrs. E.H. Cheney never existed for me. She was always Mama Borthwick to me, an individual, separate and distinct, who was not any man's possession. The children, my children, they are well provided for, as they ever were. I love them as much as any father could. In a way, my buildings are my children, he said, and he certainly wanted to be faithful to his ideals in architecture. He's spiraling. Okay. And he's like pacing up and down the room, and he is trying to come up with any bullshit he can hang on to, and it's just not really working out for him. Finally, the reporter got him to respond to a couple last questions. For example, could he not have found some way to pursue his profession while remaining with the family? Not a chance. Wright said, quote, Mrs. Wright had little time to be interested in my work, and I had little time to be interested in hers. Meaning his own children. Like, this guy is a fucking piece of shit. Continuing with the quote, she thinks I am infatuated with another woman. That isn't the whole of it. I went away because I found my life confused and my situation discordant. To have remained longer in the house in which we had lived was impossible and untrue. If I could have persuaded myself that human beings are benefited by the sacrifices others make for them, I could have lied to myself. I might have been able to stay. But there has always seemed to me to be something hypocritical in the talk of selfishness. We misuse the word to indicate meanness, just as we misuse the noble word passion to indicate uncontrolled animalism. I would be honestly myself first and take care of everything else afterward. No man is strong until he is himself. End quote. First of all, shut up, Frank. You make no sense. People benefit from the sacrifices of others all the time, but those scenarios vary wildly. What are you talking about? You can just sense that he's like panicking inside and grasping at straws. Also, during this psychotic and chaotic interview, Wright takes little breaks from answering to run over to Mama and have little whispered side conversations away from the reporter. Quote, after consulting his companion, he said her opinions were exactly the same as those which he expounded, end quote, the reporter wrote. With Mama, apparently, there was the unanimity of ideals and unwavering support that the architect had failed to find in Kitty. And you might think that this doesn't sound good, because it doesn't. Well, here is where Frank really fucks it up. Apparently, without any baiting on the journalist's part, he volunteered an unnecessary and incendiary revelation. Quote, as for the general aspect of this thing, I want to say this. Laws and rules are made for the average. The ordinary man cannot live without rules to guide his conduct. It is infinitely more difficult to live without rules, but that is what the really honest, sincere, thinking man is compelled to do. And I think when a man has displayed some spiritual power, has given concrete evidence of his ability to see and to feel the higher and better things of life, we ought to go slow in deciding he has acted badly. End quote. Elitist pronouncements of this sort would not play well in the Midwest, as the Chicago Tribune editors knew. When the interview appeared on page 1 the next morning, the article was provocatively titled, Law for Ordinary Man. I love it. I mean, I think that was nice of them. They could have gone lower than that. The public's reaction was swift and predictable. One spring green farmer gave voice to many of the locals' bewilderment. Quote, "This love affair of his is beyond me. I've only had a common school education, and when he explains why he left his wife and children in Chicago, he gets beyond my depth." End quote. Other people were pissed. On the same day that the interview appeared in print, several Spring Green residents approached Iowa County Sheriff W.R. Pengley, demanding that the lawman evict the couple from their hillside home. Sheriff Leonard Mayer of the neighboring Sauk County even offered to help in the eviction. New newspaper articles appeared, ones like "Wright in Castle, fearless of raid." When asked for a quote, Pengley said, "I don't know yet just what charge can be brought against him. If reports are true, there are several charges which might be instituted. I am in doubt, however, whether any of them can be proved. I'm ready to act the moment a citizen of Iowa County swears out a warrant for Wright's arrest. I shall act on my own accord if I find, on consultation with the district attorney, that I have the authority." Apparently, at least a few locals were prepared to take the matters into their own hands because another quote from Pengley in the newspaper is, "I told them I would do my best to thwart any attempt at tarring and feathering." The next day, Pengley backs even further away from it all, being like, I'm not doing anything. I'm not going to arrest them. I'm not even in Spring Green. The editor of Spring Green's weekly home news printed an editorial that would reflect and shape local opinion of Wright for years to come. After providing his readers with a bare-bones history of Wright's affair with Mama, this dude, named Prairie, goes on the attack. Quote, "No man or woman can live in the relation which these two brazenly flaunt and explain it to law-abiding, God-loving people in a manner that they may see no insult to decency. A father who deserts his own offspring and their faithful mother, and a woman who gives the opportunity to brand her children with this disgrace, together constitute a couple who are either insane or degenerates. Many man and woman who live together as man and wife should be legally married. Otherwise, they are a menace to the morals of a community and an insult to every family therein." Mic fucking drop. He then says, quote, "This escapade will give the architect more advertising than his knee panties, long hair, and other funny ways ever could." He then goes on to say that Frank's family, like his kin folk, are, quote, "disgusted, humiliated, and chagrined by his actions. This family contains men and women, good and true, who are giving their lives and brains to the intellectual uplift of mankind, and are doing all in their power to discourage this sort of vice and immorality. What Wright was calling ideals, Spring Green was calling sin." Wright immediately recognized that his Christmas message had not been well received. Undaunted by this failure, and confident as ever in himself and his made-up belief system, he began to churn out even more statements for the Chicago press, who was like, "Bring this fucking disaster on. Like, this is a mess. You're feeding mess to the press. They love that shit. What are you doing? You're making everything so much worse." So he is still confident in himself, but he is like, let me not do another interview. That didn't go great. And so he made a formal signed statement that he issued from Taliesin on December 30th. This is like not very long after the Christmas statement. And he is telling them, "This is from the depths of my soul." He literally says that. Interestingly, this statement is written in the third person, in a passive voice with rhetorical devices that are used to deflect any personal responsibility. Quote, "Here were 4 people, a wife and a man," he means Catherine and himself, "and a husband and a woman," meaning Edwin and Mama, "who had each assumed earlier in the life the responsibilities of marriage. Then the thing happened which has happened to men and women since time began, the inevitable. As soon as the situation developed its inevitable character, a frank avowal to those whose lives were to be affected by a readjustment to meet the new conditions which had arisen was made. Then he goes on to say, quote, "The claims of daily companionship with little children were pitted against the integrity of life that is the only real life. All was wretched, all false, all wasted," end quote. So he's saying, like, choosing between living with my kids and the only integrity in life, which is my affair, I chose my affair. Then he's talking about his work and his architectural practice being in disarray, and he says, quote, "The future of his work must be cared for and some place found or be made for the woman, the work, and himself." Then he continues, "Thus may be written the drama that is played now in countless cases behind the curtain, so that honest souls may profit. I cannot care, not much more than the selfishness of nature when the word is stripped of the meaning with which Christianity has misused it." Then he quotes Shakespeare's Othello, but he quotes the arch-villain and asks to be left alone. This guy is a fucking psycho. He then tries to patch things up with the town of Spring Green. He thanks them for their consideration and courtesy during this time, and he praises them for being able to see beyond what the press is writing, and he talks about how they're good, conventional, quiet people. Surprisingly, once Frank shuts the fuck up, he's kind of left alone. Besides a few stories in newspapers here and there, Frank and Mema just kind of settle into Taliesin without much more drama. After all, scandal, however initially thrilling, has a very short shelf life. So he falls into cohabitant bliss with Mema. They're just chilling at the house. He has an office in Chicago. He doesn't even go there anymore. He makes people come to him. But this scandal really fucked up his professional success. He did have two hefty commissions going on at this point in time, which is the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which he lied about getting that commission, but then 4 years later got it. Then he is at this point working on the Midway Gardens on Chicago's South Side, both of which are huge projects. Frank was super stoked to get the Tokyo commission. He's obsessed with Japan. And then Midway Gardens was a really famous building. It was torn down in 1929, but it said that nothing even remotely like it exists now in the world. Wright was working at Midway Gardens on the day in mid-August when he received the worst news of his life. In Spring Green, in mid-August 1914, at Taliesin were Frank, Mema, the workers, the apprentices, and two newly hired servants. Mema was the first one to die. The powerful force of the blow drove the axe blade through her thick, upswept hair and deep into her skull, splattering brain matter and pieces of bone into the air like a terrible cloud around her head. That head then falling onto the table, spattering blood everywhere. When it comes to the murders at Taliesin on Saturday, August 15th, 1914, much remains a mystery. It was a clear Saturday, another dry, hot, Midwestern summer day. 11 people were in residence at the house. As it happened, Frank Lloyd Wright was not at Taliesin that morning. He had left the previous Tuesday evening to go to Chicago to join his son John in putting some finishing touches on Midway Gardens. He was due back the very next day, that Sunday. But Mema was there, of course, overseeing the draftman's work and toiling away dutifully on her translations. Her children were there too, for their yearly summertime visit. John was 12 now. His sister Martha, sporting a page boy haircut and a sapphire birthstone ring, was 8, about to turn 9 the next month. Neither child was particularly happy to be there. In fact, they wanted to go home. Their father, Edwin, currently on a business trip, had shipped them off to Mema 2 weeks before, and there wasn't much to do at Taliesin, they thought, or many playmates to do things with. For them, the house seemed strange. Martha had invited her friend, Edna Kritz, a local farm girl, to ride over on horseback for a visit. Martha had invited another friend, Verna Ross Ondorf, to come too. But Verna's father, over his wife's protests, had forbidden his daughter to visit Taliesin that day, citing the unconventional lifestyle there, the goings-on associated with the place. He insisted that Verna would be better off, morally safer, with her parents. Edna's father, more liberal-minded, thought it would be all right for his 8-year-old to visit lonely little Martha. "Are not the children innocent?" he said, when talking it over with his wife. In addition to the family, 6 workmen, draftsmen, and laborers were lodged in the sprawling house as well. The oldest was a burly man named Tom Brunker, 66 years old, a widower. He was a devout Catholic and a father to 10 children. He worked as a general handyman and occasional foreman for Wright. William Billy Weston, 35, was at Taliesin with his 13-year-old son, Ernest. Every day the two of them rode their bicycles 4 miles to Taliesin and had done so for months. Billy was Wright's favorite carpenter, a tall, lean man with a sandy mustache. A natural carpenter, Wright called him. He was a carpenter such as architects like to stand and watch work. I never saw him make an unnecessary movement. His hammer, extra light with a handle fashioned by he himself, flashed to the right spot every time like the rapier of an expert swordsman. Weston, in fact, had built much of Taliesin. By that afternoon, he would also be the day's hero. Over in the apprentices' quarters in the north wing, the morning sun woke up 2 architectural draftsmen, Emile Brodel and Herbert Fritz. Brodel, around 30 years old, had every reason to be proud at this early stage of his career. His masterful aerial drawings for the Midway Gardens and Imperial Hotel projects had won him the respect of Wright. Now a Milwaukee resident, he was engaged to his best friend's sister. Life must have looked good. By the end of the day, Herbert Fritz from Chicago, a draftsman barely in his 20s, had been set on fire, had broken his arm, and had been knocked unconscious. And for all of that, he was the luckiest of them all. Swedish-born David Lindblom, who was either 45 or 55, depending on the source, would run a mile over rough terrain that day at a full sprint to summon help and would drag dead and dying people from the flames of the Taliesin. The middle-aged landscape gardener would perform all of these heroics with much of his flesh burned away and with the back of his head split open by an axe. He did not die until he had done all this and took time to rest. Finally, there were the servants, Julian and Gertrude Carleton, new to Taliesin. They had only begun working there in mid-June. They were an African-American couple from Chicago. They were both 30 years old and from Barbados. Or at least that's what Julian told people. His death certificate suggests that he was from Alabama. No one really knows for sure. It was John Volslang Jr., a prosperous Chicago caterer and restaurateur, who had recommended the Carletons to Wright. Edward Waller had hired Vogelsang back in May to supply food and drink for Midway Gardens. Vogelsang said that the couple had worked as house servants for his father and had done a good job. He did not know much more about them. Neither, after all of these years, do we. We do know that Julian was on the small side, about 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing 145 pounds, but that he was strong. The only photo of him suggests that he was thin-lipped, slender, dark-complexioned, well-muscled, and conventionally handsome. He and Gertrude had been married about 2 years at this time. Before going to work for Vogelsang's father, Julian had been a porter, headquartered in Chicago. After leaving Vogelsang, the couple had lived for a time in the city, where Julian took on various odd jobs, some fairly demeaning work, as an assistant janitor at the Francis Willard School. Then the Carletons landed the job at Taliesin. Gertrude would cook and Julian would serve as a kind of butler handyman around the place. They caught the train and traveled to isolated Spring Green, almost 200 miles from home. Within 2 weeks of arriving at Taliesin, Julian wanted to leave. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. I know, listen, I'm sorry. But we will finish it next week, I promise. Before we go, it's time for nature. It's fucking cool. Today we're talking about Lowe's pitcher plant. It is a pitcher with a T, Pitcher. It's a little cup. Okay, listen, there's a reason why I picked this. This plant is a tropical plant endemic to Borneo. It was discovered by Hugh Lowe on Mount Kinabalu. When this dude discovered it, he was delighted. He was like, this is an unusual plant. I love it. He said the picture of the plant could hold a little less than a pint of water and that they were all full to the brim and still supported on their little plant stalk. The outside color of the pictures are described as a bright pea green, the inside dark mahogany, the lid is green, and the glandular are mahogany colored. A very elegant claret jug might be made of this shape. Tropical pitcher plants are among the planet's stranger species, digesting ants and other insects that slip and fall into the bowl of the pitcher. But this particular pitcher plant found in Borneo is even stranger still. It gets its nutrition not from insects, but from tree shrews, who exclusively use this plant as a perfectly nature-made toilet. That's right. These little plants are very cute, but they are also perfect toilets. And the fact that animals in nature are like, this should be a toilet, that's crazy. Don't they just shit everywhere? No. Tree shrews are like, I will only shit in this plant that is shaped like a toilet. I think that's amazing. Technically, this kind of nutrition for the plant is described as novel nitrogen sequestration strategy. Basically, yeah, it digests the shrew feces, and that feces provides a significant source of nitrogen for the plants. Also, this pitcher plant is found at higher elevations where ants and other insects are less abundant. This is according to a Dr. Moran, who has studied these plants for 2 decades. Oh my God, there's one other person on the planet that's obsessed with this plant, just like I am. In its immature stage, the plant grows a bowl that is near the ground and makes do with a few ants come in and going. Nope, they don't be going. It eats them. When you start small, you have to catch something, Dr. Moran said. But the mature plant grows pitchers that are high up in the air. Tree shrews visit the plants to eat nectar that oozes from the bowl's open lid, positioning themselves directly over the bowl. Form follows function, says Dr. Moran, and then notes that this pitcher plant even looks like a toilet. Though we were too polite to say that in the paper, meaning the scientific paper that was written about these plants. So the type of this pitcher plant is Nepenthes lowi, and the tree shrew has a fascinating relationship with this specific plant. So basically the shape and structure of this plant is the perfect little perch for a tree shrew, and it gets to sit there and have a snack of nectar. And then it also gets to shit into the plant, and then the plant has food. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's a natural toilet. We love to see it. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, am I weird? I'm obsessed with this. This adaptation is an excellent example of how species can evolve to benefit one another in the wild. This is more interesting than anything Frank Lloyd Wright ever said. I'm glad we're done with him. We're getting to the murders. Next week, it's all about the murders. I'm just so irritated with him that I might not write about men ever again. Just kidding. There's serial killers to cover, but I can't. Anyways, back to this. Also interesting is that most pitcher plants are carnivorous, trapping ants and other insects that slip and fall down the sides of the pitcher, and then they fall into a pool of digestive enzymes. Talking for 2 hours about Frank Lloyd Wright makes me want to dive into a pool of digestive enzymes. Basically, it's a toilet complete with a feeding station, said study team member Jonathan Moran of Royal Roads University in British Columbia. Oh, it's Dr. Moran. Said Dr. Moran. Dr. Moran, are you single? Write a note and circle Y or N. The team at the University of Cambridge set up video cameras that recorded activities around several Nepenthes lowi pitcher plants in a mountainous cloud forest on the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia. That video, they didn't know that this was happening before that video. They were like, I don't think it's eating bugs, the ones that are up really high. And they were speculating on what it fed off of. And then they put up the video cameras. They had a hunch it was feces related. But then they were like, oh, it's the tree shrews. And yes, The video even showed that tree shrews mark the plants with their scent by rubbing their genitals onto the lid before running away. Also, the tree shrews often visit the same circuit of pitcher plants when feeding. We've found little to no evidence of invertebrate prey in the aerial pitchers, Moran said. They've effectively lost the capability to trap animals. Loei has modified their aerial pitcher to be a toilet, Moran said. For instance, the rim of the pitcher is not slippery like it is in the insect trapping varieties, such as the ground-laying, terrestrial, and Loei pitchers. That way, tree shrews stay safe from a fall while eating and pooping. It's very tough. There's lots of reinforcement because the pitcher is hanging off the end of a leaf and it has to be able to support a tree shrew, Moran said, adding that tree shrews can weigh less than half a pound. Also, Loei produces the largest known quantity of nectar of any of the Nepenthes species, enough to fill the bellies of all the hungry tree shrews. Also noted is that there's no way for the shrews to miss the hole. The shape of the pitcher opening and the orientation of the leaf lid that's coated with nectar ensure that the tree shrews will position their hindquarters over the opening while feeding. Moran adds, plus it's a funnel, so the next time it rains, the feces will be washed into the pitcher. These adaptations make sense in this mountainous environment where insect prey is scarce. Both the ground and aerial types of this pitcher plant ultimately suck out the nitrogen from their meals, using it to grow. But while the ground plants feed on crumbs, the aerials feed to their heart's content, as the tree shrews are plentiful at such high altitudes in Borneo. The partnership is likely an old one. Moran says the fact that the aerial pitchers are so tailored to the shape and activities of the tree shrew suggests this has been going on for a long time. The conservation status of N. loei is listed as vulnerable and is on the red list of threatened species. We need to protect nature's perfect toilet plant at all costs. And that is it for today's episode. I hope you clutched your pearls at the scandal. I feel so bad for Kitty. Ugh. And Edwin. Edwin didn't do nothing to no one. But yeah, shit's about to get gory, and I know we're all ready for it. So I will see you next time. It'll be soon. I'm not going to wait 2 months. Don't worry. And we will finish up this mass murder. Until then, every time you poop, think about nature's perfect toilet, the pitcher plant. Okay, I'll talk to you next time. Bye! Full source notes are available at mistressofthemacablepodcast.com, as well as photos pertaining to each episode. Follow along on Instagram for all the insane and gory photos at Mistress of the Macabre Podcast. Please leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps the show grow, and I will love you forever. And tell a friend, if you even have any. Bonus content is available at patreon.com or on Apple Podcast subscriptions. I'm just one young teenage girl writing, researching, producing, editing, and recording the show. Your support goes a long way. If you have topic ideas, questions, comments, animal facts, or unsettling stories you'd like to share, email me at mistressofthemacablepodcast@gmail.com.